You may remember that we had the session on salt and light in Matthew 5. Also the fulfillment of the law. We talked about that. We also talked about the section on murder that Jesus talked about some very significant issues, and we'll bring those up in a moment. This morning, we're going to be looking at the section 527 to 32 on marriage, adultery, and divorce. Next week on oaths, taking an oath, and what's at stake and why Jesus brings it up. And then eye for an eye, 538 to 42. And then chapter 5 closes out with love for one's enemies. I thought about this as I was driving over here this morning. It struck me that in Jesus' teachings, the Sermon on the Mount is a significant section where Jesus is not answering anyone's questions. When you go through the Gospels, there are several occasions that become sort of teaching moments for Jesus, and it may be based on something that's just happened, or it may be someone has asked a question. But in the Sermon on the Mount, it's not that way. Jesus starts off with his teaching, and he sets the agenda. And I find it fascinating that when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, I suppose, could have chosen a number of other issues to address, but the ones on the Sermon on the Mount apparently are paramount for him, especially when it comes to two things. One is, what does kingdom living need to look like? And number two, what does it mean to be a disciple? And when you kind of keep those two things in mind, it helps you realize why Jesus chose these. Already we've had significant insights into discipleship. First, just the whole notion of influence. And we can't understate this and we can't overstate it. It's just so crucial. As a disciple, we must never, never, never forget our influence. And in order to make this point very strongly, Jesus is going to use two metaphors, that of salt and light. One who is a disciple does not set aside the commands and teachings of Jesus. And what's implied here is something interesting, that when you're a disciple, you willingly submit to the authority of Jesus. And you realize that your life is not being lived on your own terms anymore. That you're saying to Jesus, truly, you are my Lord, and I want to live by your direction and your teachings. And depending on what it is, sometimes that's hard for us, isn't it? That we have our minds made up and going in a certain direction. And that's why, and this is, I wanted to say this as I was thinking about this, this is why we need to be real gracious and forgiving and understanding for new converts. When a person becomes a disciple and a new disciple of Jesus, there's a whole lot of things that they have to learn to begin to submit, and that's not an easy thing. And we all can attest that to our own journey. The disciple practices and teaches what Jesus did, and that individual is called great in the kingdom of heaven. And righteousness has to surpass that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And it doesn't mean you become more pharisaical and more legalistic to surpass them. That's not what he's implying. He's implying that you embrace a whole different way of looking at religion, a whole different way of looking at getting at the heart of the issues in order to live for God, not for self. And so righteousness has to surpass that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, and that means that you are then considered great in the kingdom. And we looked at murder, and for discipleship, there are some key issues here. If I am a disciple of Jesus, it's interesting to look at the passages in the New Testament, and we obviously don't have time to do that this morning, but all of the teaching in the New Testament about anger. You probably, well, we won't ask for illustrations in your life, but I will say this. You probably can think rather quickly of an occasion in your life when you let anger get the best of you, and when you think back on it, your first description would be, that really didn't portray the life of a disciple very well, did it? And so just the human emotion of anger, if it's not under control of the lordship of Jesus, it then controls us, and we certainly don't portray the mind of Christ. In this particular section, we also learned about how significant reconciliation is between people when there's a falling out. This is the difference between Christians and non-Christians. Non-Christians have no really compelling reason for reconciliation. We get at odds over something, and if I'm not a Christian, that's your tough luck. I just want to make sure that in that disagreement, I come out on top somehow. Well, that's not the way the Christian looks at it. If there's a falling out and a difference, if I have the mind of Christ and I truly am a disciple, I'm going to initiate repairing that relationship. That's where the mind of Christ kicks in. Now, of course, there are no guarantees that reconciliation will occur all because I took initiative, but one thing for sure, it won't occur if I don't take the initiative. And so for the Christian, that's where the mindset is much different. And then, in an interesting way, we saw that our gifts offered to God, and for Jesus' original audience, it would be the sacrificial gifts in the temple around the altar. And you assume that what Matthew is wanting his audience to recognize is the same parallel is true for Christians when they assemble. That everything that you do in offering as a gift to God in collective worship, the same thing is true. If there's something wrong, and I've got something really bad going on between myself and someone else, God is vitally interested that I get that taken care of. I think I've told you this illustration. I may give it again if you haven't heard it. This was a number of years ago. I had a significant difference with someone in the congregation, and I was clear that they were in the wrong, but I thought, okay, when the time is right, I sort of have in my back pocket an ACE card that has listed all the things that they have said that are wrong and all the ways they've treated me. I'm just ready for the right moment to plop that on the table and use it. Well, behold, one Sunday morning, a deacon got up and in preparation for the Lord's Supper, did something really, benign, I would say, but just said that let's think about the characteristics of love as we get ready for communion. Well, this person's reading down through 1 Corinthians 13, and would you know it, that in 1 Corinthians 13, one of the characteristics of love is, depending on which translation you use, but you don't hold any grudges against someone. I was like, oh. Like, it hit me between the eyes. Man, I've been doing that. Like, wow. And then I realized there's no need for me to take communion. It's not going to mean anything if I don't get my heart right soon, because pretty soon the communion was going to be passed around. I did some hard praying right then. And then I made sure that Sunday, after that I initiated some things that needed to be said. And it was a hard lesson for me. And you may have learned that too, that God is vitally concerned on our relationships so that when we collectively assemble to worship, we are not pretending that things are okay when they're not. Have you noticed about God? God hates pretense. I mean, you can just write that on as significant. Okay, let's look at our passage. That's been all kind of background to get where we are. I think what I'd like to do, if you'll follow along, I want to read chapter 5, 27 through 32. And then I want to set the background for this discussion. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Verse 31, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness, I think some translations say adultery, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. As we look at this particular passage, I want to set the stage with a couple of comments. One is, I want us to look at the Jewish background and practice that occasioned Jesus to offer this teaching. And then the other is to realize that Jesus is giving this teaching, as we mentioned, within the confines of discipleship, kingdom living, and a huge implication about the value of covenant relationships. That husband and wife relationship is only transcended by one other relationship, and that's your relationship with God. But that both of those relationships are rooted in an appreciation of and living in covenant faithfulness. Very, very important to understand that. As we begin looking at this, Jesus says, and it's interesting because he doesn't just quote what you have heard in terms of rabbinic tradition. He actually is quoting the commandment itself. You've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. And when he says that, he's going to sort of take to task a lot of common practice in his day, which was interpretation of that particular text to favor the husband in a patriarchal society. And we'll see that here in just a moment. See, this assumes the rabbinic tradition and interpretation that goes along with it. And I want to share with you some historical insight. And I had known this, I just didn't know where to find it or hadn't taken the time. And I think we'll show this on one of the slides coming up. The whole discussion here seems to center around how people took Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. So if you have your Old Testaments, turn to Deuteronomy, and you'll see that this becomes then the basis for discussion for Judaism. Deuteronomy 24, and I want to read verses 1 through, let's see, how far do I want to go down? Let's go down through verse 4, because that includes some phrases that we need to look at. Deuteronomy 24, 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she's been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Let me see what I've got on my... Yeah, one of my teachers at school said this, and I'll throw this out for you. This is the big phrase this morning, and then we'll talk about it. No such thing as presuppositionless exegesis, which means none of us go to Scripture to seek its meaning with a blank slate. Now, the reason I say that is because Alexander Campbell came from the Scottish common sense philosophy, and he thought that you could approach the Bible without any assumptions and biases and prejudices in the background. What's interesting is, as he got older, he realized that was impossible and wrote a little bit about it. But he just hated to admit that he was really impacted by others and really thought of himself as an original thinker. What that means is when we come to Scripture, all of us have backgrounds, lenses through which we see Scripture. And sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not so good, depending on the perspective. But if we all admit that we've been impacted by our heritage, by our culture, by what other people have said and taught, that's important for us to realize it. Well, the Jews didn't realize, or at least didn't admit, that their history of interpretation was what really sort of drove them in this issue, and Jesus is bringing this up. So when we look at verses, let's see. Well, I'll skip that because I want to go on. Verse 31 is from Deuteronomy 24, 1 and following. We have here in Deuteronomy 24 the issue between two basic rabbinic schools. And you may know this, but this is important to be aware of because when we read Deuteronomy 24, there are two phrases that became hugely controversial among Jews. Earlier, he says in Deuteronomy 24:1, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. Now you might say, well, that's a pretty broad phrase. Well, it was. And then look a little bit later. That would be detestable. Oh, okay. It's basically that phrase. Become displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. Okay, that's the main phrase. Well, in the strict school, rabbinic school of Shammai, this was taken to mean sexual sin or perhaps gross impropriety. But the liberal school of Jesus' day, the Hillel, the rabbinic school of Hillel, argued that it could be anything that displeased the husband. And in fact, there are two big sections in the Mishnah, and I don't know if I put them on a PowerPoint or not, but there are two huge sections, and the Mishnah is the written down rabbinic tradition. By the 3rd century, all of this was written down, and we think that most of what's in the Mishnah was in practice and understood during Jesus' day, even though it's about 200 years later written down, but we're pretty sure it's pretty accurate. The liberal school of Hillel argued that it could be anything that displeased the husband. In fact, if you look in one of the sections, even something as burning his dinner would displease the husband, so it would be grounds for a divorce. Now, notice what Jesus addresses, and it is part of the practice, that it's important if, for whatever reason, the husband wanted to give a divorce, he couldn't just, and I was reading in the two sections of the Mishnah, and like, wow. One section, I think, is 167 pages. The other's 142. And you talk about minute detail in almost every situation you could think of. It goes through it. The huge issue had to do up front about this writing of certificate for divorcement. A husband just couldn't walk out on his wife. He had to have a certain way. In fact, as I was reading that section on the Mishnah, there was a specific way the certificate had to be written out and how it had to be witnessed to. So all this detail stuff, very legalistic, but if, and here's the thing, if the husband filled out the certificate in every way that fulfilled the details of the requirement, well, then he would be granted the divorce. And what Jesus is really struggling with here to address is on either end, and think about this, on the one end, the marriage covenant doesn't mean anything. If the wife burns the dinner, well, then he can just get rid of her. On the other hand, there was a strict view, which really wasn't biblical because Jesus is going to go back to the beginning to talk about it. But there was a strict view that since the wife is the property of the husband, she's bound to him no matter what. And Jesus is trying to address both of those extremes. What is missing in all of that, and he knows it, is a covenant view of marriage where that husband and wife are committed to each other. And this was a hard teaching because in Judaism in Jesus' day, there was still the very strong practice and thinking that the wife is the property of the husband. And I was doing some reading, and this was interesting. When you look at the cultural background, many thought of adultery as sexual sin with a married woman. That was the key. What the guy did didn't matter, but it was what she did because she was viewed as property of the husband. Like, really? And so when you begin to look at how the Jews thought of that, you can appreciate how Jesus is wording this. And one particular writer had a paragraph I wanted to share with you because it helped me a little bit. Because he makes this comment, and think about how we've been talking about this. Jesus wants to move away from a legalistic ritual view of religion. Same thing with relationships, even husband and wife. He wants to move away from a ritual, legalistic relationship. And unfortunately, in much of Christian interpretation, with this section on marriage, divorce, and adultery in Matthew chapter 5, we've done that very thing. We've approached it from a very legalistic, ritualistic kind of view, and that's not what Jesus is really trying to attempt to do here. Remember the exception clause in Matthew 5? It has evoked, of course, a lot of discussion, and we don't have time to look at all the options. But by including an exception clause, Matthew has in principle indicated that if there is one exception, there can be others. He does not attempt to prescribe what these might be, but he illustrates the fact that Jesus' teaching must be interpreted by case without establishing a rigid law that makes an exception in only one case. Now, when I read that, that was helpful for me. Let me tell you why. 2 reasons. Through the years, I've had to counsel women who would come in my office whose husbands have been very abusive, physically, emotionally, and whatever. And she thinks in order to be faithful to God, she has to stay in that abusive relationship. And I would say that at the very heart of that kind of situation, covenant has been broken. Now, what you do about it in every case, I don't have the wisdom of Solomon to pronounce that, but I'm convinced covenant has been broken. Let me give you another illustration. One church, and we had an interesting situation occur where one lady in the congregation, and this was her wording, she fell out of love with her husband, but she fell in love with the mail carrier. Okay, so she told the elders of the church, she said, I've got this all figured out. If I can just get the mail carrier baptized, then I can marry him. I'm like, huh? And what's been astounding to me through the years is to watch how people treat marriage like a contract they can get out of instead of a covenant to be faithful to. Now that's just it. And when you view it that way, you're going to have all kinds of strange situations of people trying to wiggle out of relationships. Now, there are exceptions. And of course, Jesus is addressing one of them here in Matthew chapter 5. And like I said, I don't have, all of the wisdom to know what to do when you mess up the ideal. Because I've seen them. If we had time this morning, I could just share with you, event after event where you think you've seen it all, then the next one comes through the door, it's a new one. So I think what we have to promote is what Jesus is promoting. Number one, if we truly are disciples who have the mind of Christ, we take seriously our covenant relationship with God. Number two, we take seriously our covenant relationship with Christ. With husband and wife. And it's Paul's teaching on that sets the stage for something that's really beautiful. Turn over to Ephesians chapter 5. Of course, you know this passage, Ephesians chapter 5. But if you look at what's at the core of this, and I would call this is the biblical foundation for husband and wife. Yes. That's exactly right. Well, you know, you know what? That is behind Jesus' point that if a man looks lustfully after another woman, what does he say? He's committed adultery already in his heart. And I think what would have shocked his audience was to hear that the man could commit adultery. I mean, they didn't think that way. And I think it would have shocked some of his audience. But what Jesus does, in addition to shocking his audience, he gets to the heart of it. What are you looking at and what's in your heart? Oh, that's a different story. Different story. Right. And that commitment is to one another. And look at what Paul does with this. In Ephesians chapter 5. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, there's been a history of interpretation in Christianity that's taken this idea of being head of the wife, I think, in a wrong way. That it's almost like, do what I say and shut up. I mean, that's the short version of it. And that's not at all what Paul means here with this. I want you to think about how Christ has been the head of the church. He loves the church, sacrificially gave his life for the church. Jesus is nowhere along the line telling us, do as I say and shut up. You can't read that in his teachings. He is dedicated, even today, in his ministry. Jesus is dedicated to our well-being. And what he sacrificed and gave up demonstrates what a head ought to be like. And I think if more husbands took seriously the example of Christ in the church, marriages would be in a whole lot different shape today. Then he says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And of course, that's a quote from Genesis 2:24. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So even in Paul's day, as he lays down this whole relationship between husband and wife, it's pretty challenging because what it looks like that Paul is saying, there needs to be mutual respect on both sides. And it kind of gets at the heart of a patriarchal system which looks at women as just property. So I don't think we realize in Matthew 5 and in Ephesians 5, Jesus' teaching and Paul's teaching was pretty radical, going against the cultural norms of how people thought about husband and wife relationship. Let's see. Yeah, I wanted to share with you, I think we got just a moment to share with you an insight Jesus' teaching doesn't abolish the 10 Commandments against adultery, but Jesus is reaffirming it. And there's a comment here about the cultural thing, and I'll mention this because it goes along with what I said earlier. So understood, adultery must involve a married woman. A married man who has extramarital relations with an unmarried woman was considered immoral, but not guilty of adultery. And likewise, for the unmarried woman who has an affair with a married man. Now that was pretty insightful for me to think about how Judaism thought about that. And it's that fine distinction that Jesus says, no, let's quit being legalistic about this. Let's get back to the covenant relationship between husband and wife. Because as it was understood in the practice of Judaism, the man could get off the hook. And you know where we see this? In the Gospel of John, when the woman's caught in adultery, who do they bring to Jesus? Where's the guy? Well, you got to understand something. He got off the hook. Judaism could find ways to let him off the hook. And Jesus knows that in that occasion, there's some wrong thinking here. And again, remember we said earlier when we started off this study about Jesus is constantly, and certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, he lays down the principles here that we can see this. He is constantly going to poke his finger in some pretty deep, sensitive issues that religious people had sort of accepted and not really thought about the deeper part of it. And Jesus is bringing people in Matthew 5:27-32 back to an appreciation of God's original intent of a lifetime covenant commitment between husband and wife. What a great way to do this. Now, what we don't know is how to handle all the exceptions when marriage gets torn up and when divorce occurs. In the past, there have been certain strains of Christian teaching that would lend you to think they've got it all figured out, and if you don't follow a particular path, well, then you'll be withdrawn from. Well, I think that actually goes against what Jesus is trying to do here. And we can talk a little bit more about that next week because our time is up. But I'm just amazed in this particular section what Jesus was trying to do that was going against how the Jews thought of marriage. You think about how many centuries this long-standing view in a patriarchal society between what men could get by with and what women couldn't who were married. I mean, that was just standard. And Jesus says, we got to rethink this. And that's what got him into trouble. His whole ministry in teaching, we got to rethink this. That's what got him in trouble. Well, thank you all for being here this morning.